If you asked most people to describe a Viking, they'd say the same thing. Tall, blonde, blue-eyed, from Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. That's the image on every TV show, every movie poster, every history textbook. And it's wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. In 2020, scientists published the largest ancient DNA study of Vikings ever attempted. 442 ancient genomes, burial sites across 14 countries, 6 centuries of Viking Age data. And what they found didn't just challenge the Viking myth, it demolished it. Here's the story most of us grew up with. The Vikings were Scandinavians, pure-blooded Norse warriors who lived in isolated fjords, worshipped Odin, raided coastal towns, and died with their longships. Their genetic roots, we assumed, ran deep and unbroken into the ancient people of Northern Europe. They looked a certain way. They came from a certain place. And when the Viking Age ended in the 11th century, their descendants stayed put, becoming the modern Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes we know today. It's a clean story, satisfying, easy to visualize. The only problem is that genetics doesn't work that way. Because when researchers at the University of Copenhagen started pulling ancient DNA from Viking Age burial sites, from the teeth and bones that had sat untouched for 1,000 years, the picture that came back looked nothing like the one on the poster. The 2020 Nature study was led by a team of over 100 researchers across Europe and North America. They analyzed remains from burial sites in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, Greenland, the British Isles, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Some of the individuals buried with Viking weapons, Viking jewelry, and Viking grave goods, people that any archaeologist would confidently label Viking, had DNA that pointed not to Scandinavia, but to the British Isles, to Southern Europe, to Eastern European steppe populations. And that wasn't even the most surprising part. The most surprising part was what was happening inside Scandinavia itself. Researchers found that during the Viking Age, Scandinavia received a massive inflow of foreign DNA from the British Isles, from Southern Europe, from the continent. So much foreign genetic input that the DNA of Viking Age Scandinavians actually looks less Scandinavian by modern standards than the people who had lived there before them. Stop and think about what that means. The people we call Vikings weren't the ancestors of modern Norwegians. In many cases, they were descended from people who had already left Norway behind. Here's where it gets even more interesting. If you want to find people who carry the highest concentration of ancient Viking genetic markers today, the last place you'd look is Oslo or Stockholm. The highest concentrations of ancient Norse ancestry are found in Iceland, in the Scottish Islands, particularly Orkney and Shetland, in parts of Ireland, and in pockets of northern Russia, along the old Varangian trade routes. Iceland was settled almost entirely by Norwegian Vikings and their Irish and Scottish thralls, slaves taken during raids. The genetic blend that resulted has stayed largely isolated for 1,000 years. Modern Icelanders carry something close to a frozen snapshot of late Viking Age Norse DNA. The Orkney Islands, which were under Norse control for over 500 years, still show some of the highest levels of Scandinavian ancestry in the entire British Isles, even after centuries of mixing with Scottish populations. And in Russia, along the river routes that Viking traders used to reach Constantinople, researchers found ancient burial sites with Scandinavian genetic signatures hundreds of miles inland from the Baltic coast. The Vikings didn't stay in Scandinavia. They seeded their DNA across an enormous geographic range. And ironically, in many of those places, it survived better than it did back home. Now, let's talk about the look, because this is where the study produced its most uncomfortable finding for popular culture. Many of the people buried in Viking Age Scandinavia, particularly in Denmark and southern Sweden, carried genes for dark hair and brown eyes. Not all of them, but enough to fundamentally complicate the idea that Vikings were uniformly pale, blonde, and blue-eyed. The blonde hair and light eyes we associate with Scandinavia are real, but they're a feature of northern Scandinavia, particularly Norway. They appear consistently in Viking Age Norwegian samples, But the genetic diversity across the Viking world was far broader than the Hollywood image suggests. The researchers also found something fascinating about gene flow and appearance. As Vikings raided and traded across Britain, Ireland, and southern Europe, they brought back not just treasure, but people, partners, children. And those genetic contributions changed the physical profile of Scandinavian populations over the course of just a few generations. The pure Viking image that popular culture has built wasn't just wrong, it was the opposite of what the archaeological record shows. The Vikings were uniquely cosmopolitan for their era. A warrior buried in Denmark might carry Scottish ancestry. A raider from Norway might have been born to an Irish mother. That's not a footnote, that's the story. So, if genetics didn't define who was a Viking, what did? The study's lead author, Professor Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen, put it clearly. Being a Viking was a profession, not a bloodline. The Norse word Vikinger referred to someone who went on a sea voyage, a raider, an explorer, a trader. It was a role you could take on, not a heritage you were born into. Non-Scandinavian men joined Viking crews. There is DNA evidence of individuals from the British Isles and continental Europe buried in full Viking warrior regalia in Scandinavian graves. They had adopted the culture completely. They were Vikings, just not Scandinavian ones. The study also overturned another long-held assumption, that Viking raids were a male-only activity. Ancient DNA from several high-status Viking burial sites, previously assumed to be male, were found, on genetic analysis, to be female. Women traveled with Viking expeditions. Women were buried as warriors. The field is still working through the implications. What this study really proved is that our image of the Vikings was never really about history. It was about a story we wanted to tell, about ethnic purity, about genetic destiny, about the idea that blood determines identity. The actual Vikings were messier, more diverse, and far more interesting than that story allowed. Ancient DNA doesn't just rewrite individual stories, it rewrites the assumptions that stories are built on. For centuries, we looked at historical groups, Vikings, Romans, Egyptians, Native Americans, and we projected modern ideas about ethnicity and identity backwards onto them. We assumed that people who shared a culture must have shared a bloodline. Genetics keeps proving that assumption wrong, repeatedly. Across every civilization we study, the Vikings weren't a race. They were a movement, maritime, aggressive, adaptive, and astonishingly connected to the wider world for a people living in the 8th century. And the DNA of the people they mixed with, traded with, raided, married, and had children with is still out there, carried quietly in the genomes of people in Iceland, in Orkney, in Ireland, in Russia, people who may have no idea they're walking around with a piece of Viking history inside them. If you've ever done an ancestry test and seen unexpected Scandinavian results show up, there's a real chance that's exactly what it is. Not a computer error. A Viking. If this video changed how you think about Viking history, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. And if you want more stories about what ancient DNA is rewriting right now, subscribe. Because this is just one of dozens of cases where genetics has completely overturned what we thought we knew about the ancient world. The next one is even more surprising. I'll see you there.